that really played a role as I got older and navigated the system. And even till this day, sometimes I have to have little talks with myself, like, you are enough, or you're intelligent enough, or, you don't have to speak a certain way. You don't have to compromise any of your identities to seem, successful or smart, so the imposter syndrome plays a role in a lot of, I think, in a lot of my like later life experiences. And I think it directly ties to that lack of representation when I was younger, of not learning anything about my own culture in the classroom, not seeing myself reflected in the many spaces that I existed and I was learning in. So it's more the impact that of the lack of having educators of color in front of me.
Yeah. First, thank you, Alexis. It's always a joy to be in touch with and interact with former students. So if there's anything that I did that allowed you to arrive at this place, that makes me happy. Also want to acknowledge that I'm as a professor at University of California, Berkeley, I sit on the Ohlone, land of the Ohlone people. And as I tell my students on the first day of class, this land was not made for you. This land was not made for me. So probably somewhat different than Carla, I went to what I would term now an Afrocentric school starting in pre-K. And from pre-K up until 6th grade, all of my teachers were Black. Most of it was a private religious school. It's still present in Brooklyn, New York, in East New York, Brooklyn. Most of my classmates were Black or Latinx, specifically Puerto Rican. I still remember in the 1st grade, my 1st grade teacher, Miss Marshall, instructing us to write letters to the apartheid government. I'm dating myself here, but to write letters to the government in South Africa to free Nelson Mandela. I remember in the 1st grade reading about Crispus Attucks. If you don't know who Crispus Attucks is, it's a quiz. You can, And so that part of the founding of this country was that Black people were so central to the founding of this country. Yes, I learned about slavery, and I learned about Nat Turner and Harriet Tubman. And for a variety of reasons, I went to a public school. Life became expensive. I was raised by a single mother. And I still remember on the first day in 7th grade, or not the first day, but I don't know, the first couple of weeks in 7th grade when I heard that Christopher Columbus had discovered America. The first time I heard this, I was in the 7th grade. And once I went to public school, this was a white teacher, my world became violently Eurocentric. And so I would say that some of the confidence that I have that has allowed me to navigate institutions that have not been interested in my well-being, they come from my mother, and they have come from attending a school where my teachers centered the experiences of me, and I learned that history and her story was about Black people and Blackness.
Thank you both for sharing. Travis, you also know that I'm from Brooklyn, New York, and I went to an all-Black school. I don't know if you went to People's Academy, but that was and Carla, your naming imposter syndrome also definitely resonates with me as well. And I'm just curious. I know both of you are public school educators, grades K through 12, and I'm just interested if you could share more about your classroom experiences and how you've arrived at the role you're currently in right now at UC Berkeley and at Equity Institute.
Yeah, that is such an important question, because it is directly tied. My personal experiences are directly tied to the work that I'm engaged in today, and to the urgency that we're working to address many of the inequities that we see in our education system today. So I want to start with talking about how I became a teacher. And I want to just say that I never just like I never thought I didn't ever dream of or had a vision to run an organization. It just kind of happened. The same thing about teaching. I had never thought about being a teacher. I always had worked in the nonprofit sector at different capacities and had worked in previous job roles with the youth for some time. But back in 2014, and this is not that long ago, it's only like 6-7 years ago, I was working at the Met High School in Providence as an admissions recruiter, going to different schools around the state and talking about the high school. And my mentor and friend at the time, Dennis Litke, just said one day, why don't you teach? And I sat with that question and thought about it and said, why not? Sure. Yeah, I should teach, right? And I was not the traditional candidate. I was 34. I was a single mother of 2 boys. I had a bachelor's degree, but it was in business. And so I just decided that, yeah, I should go into the classroom. I've always loved working with youth. I was a mom, I felt like I was already had that role down packed. I was teaching all the time, and I enrolled in a master's program. It was a teacher, 1-year teacher residency program, and it had a specific focus on social justice and multicultural education defined by Dr. James A. Banks. The 2 points I want to raise here are, I think that are really important, is one, I had never thought about teaching until somebody suggested it to me. So that pushes us to think of ways in our organization and the work that we do internally and externally on how we're attracting and recruiting talent out there, and talent that we might not even think about, right? And so just thinking about those high impact recruitment strategies are, I think, critical to some of the topic that we're talking about today. The second one is the program that I enrolled in was a solid program. It was a high quality program. It really prepared me for the classroom. So high quality program equals well-prepared teachers. And so the program that I went to, it was based here in Rhode Island. It no longer exists. It wasn't making enough money. So I was actually in the last cohort, and it was a residency program that was started by a school here, and it was in collaboration with the higher ed institution, Roger Williams University. I then entered the classroom and felt really, really ready. Like I had this year-long experience. I had been taking classes at night, teaching during the day. And I really got to apply all the educational pedagogies and theories and put that into practice. I want to say that I'm going to list another barrier here. I was not certified. So I was teaching with an emergency certification at a charter school at the time. And that the certification process was really challenging for me. I took the science test, I think 4 times, and the math 6 times, and all paid by me. I ended up becoming really good friends with the people at the testing site. I mean, they knew me. They're like, hey, Carla, like, good luck, and I was like, oh, I hope I pass. But it took me almost a year to actually pass the certification and many, many attempts. As I was saying, building a community in my classroom was not a challenge. I had 28 students, and I felt really prepared. I felt prepared in managing them and creating a safe, trusting space for my kids. However, what was the most challenging for me was the institution in itself, and dealing with the very white supremacy culture that existed in this institution. And that was my biggest challenge. After a year of teaching, I was pushed out. I did not want to stop teaching, but I did not fit there, and so was pushed out. So the 3 key things that I want to share with you all that were my learnings, and I think contribute to why I sit here today doing the work that I do, is one, we need to change the certification process. We need alternative ways in assessing teachers and their capabilities. We know, many people here might already know that the testings that are really rooted in biases. They also don't accurately measure teachers' capabilities or intelligence. And so we need to be really thinking innovatively how we are assessing teachers. Then second is the lack of culturally responsive leaders and institutions. We need more work in this area to prepare our leaders so that they can lead in equitable, anti-racist, and culturally responsive ways, and use that lens specifically to build the culture in their schools. So remember, I was saying that I was not the traditional teacher candidate. So what I mean by that is that I'm not white, I was not young, I was 34, and I was a mother. And so the very rigid, I think, sets of expectations of this school were not designed to meet my identities. So I think at the time it was me and another teacher who we were the only ones in the whole building who had children, and I had two at that. So it was very hard for me to exist in that environment. I felt very alone all the time. I felt like I was always, advocating for the things that I believed in, that should be in the classroom, and changing certain practices in the institutions. And that was not received or embraced in a positive way. And then the last one is my learnings is that tokenism is real. So even though I didn't have that the support from the leaders and the institution as a whole, my classroom was used to showcase what the school was doing in terms of diversity. I mean, I had people coming in my classroom all the time, checking out my walls, checking out my lessons, because I really taught from this equitable lens. And so we had diversity walls, and we had different things that we would use to build community, to have real conversations about the students' lived experiences inside the classroom and outside of the classroom, and like the real world at large. And so I think that being used in that way was also not a great feeling. And it was very evident. And so it was pushed out. But the performative piece of the school was, we can showcase her classroom, but we're not doing the real work to support and to retain this teacher. And so those specific experiences pushed me out, not only that space, but in many other spaces too, because as we all know, there are many of our institutions are grounded in these white supremacy cultural characteristics. And so one thing that I've learned in all of this is, when you've had to walk out so many doors, you just have to build your own. And it's the reason why I'm here today. So you have to put your name on it, forge the key, open the door, and do the work. And so now we're working to, work with districts and communities to build equitable and anti-racist communities, to diversify the education workforce, and mostly, to increase the recruiting and retention of linguistically and racially diverse teachers, so that all our students have that opportunity to have that representation in their classrooms. And I'll stop there.
Thanks, Carla. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Go ahead, Travis.
I was going to say that some of my there are some similarities in terms of the testing and not thinking about teaching as a profession that really sort of dovetailed with Carla. Both the middle school, I went to once I left this private school, I went to a public middle school and a public high school in New York City, where I experienced nothing short of educational neglect. Both of those schools no longer exist. They've been closed down because they were educational neglect, committing educational malpractice. The high school that I attended, every day we had a metal detector, and so I had to walk through the metal detector, the airport went out, and I had to get my bag scanned. So everything was police. Then all of a sudden, I did well. I had a white college counselor who told me to apply to a bunch of these small schools that I'd never heard of in New England, and I got into most of them. I eventually ended up going to Amherst College, which is in Western Massachusetts. And so I got to Amherst, and of course, I wanted to become a lawyer because I knew what it was like to be a Pell Grant student. And that's not what I wanted. But one day I saw this advertisement that's from the Rockefeller Brothers Fund Foundation, and it said, if you want to become a teacher, we'll give you $20,000 and then 3 years of loan repayment. And I thought, well, you know, Amherst is giving me, I had zero loans from Amherst, and I like, you know, not having to pay anybody money. So I'll try this teaching thing. And so I got on a plane. I went to Stanford to do my teaching credential. I'd never been to California. And I said, you know, I'll try teaching for a couple of years. So I think one, the takeaway is that that foundations like Nellie Mae can play a huge role in getting people to actually think about teaching as a profession. One of the reasons I don't want to get into a Teach for America debate, but one of the reasons why Teach for America and alt cert programs like BTR, which you attended, Alexis, has had some success in getting more folks of color is because they are operating at a reduced cost. What person will pay $50,000 if you come from a class from family that you have not built generational wealth? You're not going to go into teaching on average. So that foundation, the Rockefeller Brothers Fund Foundation, offering me free tuition to get a master's is really what incentivized me to think about teaching. And then when I got to Stanford, very similar to Carla, I struggled with the teacher certification exams. And I say this, and now I chair the California Department of Education's Teacher Advisory Group. And I'm a professor at University of California, Berkeley. I have a PhD from Columbia, a master's from Stanford, undergraduate degree from Amherst College. And I struggled mightily, right, with the teacher certification exams. And so I do think that it's important for us to think about multiple measures when we think about entry into the profession. But nonetheless, I decided to become a teacher. I went back to New York City. I taught high school for 5 years. And I think that one of the things that has informed my work now is that I receive high quality prep. When I entered my classroom on day one, I understood how to create heterogeneous groups. I understood how to use formative assessments to create some summative assessments, right? I knew how to listen to what students were saying in small groups and bring it back into a whole group discussion. I could create a whole group and small group discussion. I received fantastic prep. And it was my sense, both when I was a classroom teacher and when I began training teachers in a teacher preparation program, that people thought that I was only successful because I was Black, that my students just listened to me because I was this Black man, that there was something magical about me, and not realizing that I was a skilled teacher. I was trained. And so that has really informed some of my work now around thinking about and so because people didn't necessarily see me as a practitioner, there was very little attention to build my practice. And so lots of my work now is studying and creating professional learning communities for educators of color where they can get some feedback on their practice, because in their school site, on average, men of color and teachers of color more broadly are not deemed as practitioners. They're deemed as the translator, the police officer. So my work in practice as a teacher has informed my current research.
Thank you both. And you're both kind of like segueing me to think about another question. So Carla and Travis, you just spoke about like some misconceptions that you both experienced in the classroom. And there's plenty of research that shows the benefits of having educators of color in the classroom, right? So improved graduation rates and test scores and aspirations to attend college and, more positive relations with students. And I'm curious about what are some of the misconceptions that you've heard, both as a former educator and in your role now, and how do you go about mitigating those in your daily work?
Yeah. I thought what Travis was what he just mentioned about being looked at you were just good in building relationships because you're a Black educator. It was so true, and a good segue to this next question. For me, one of the things that I often hear is there are not any qualified teacher candidates. And we get emails and we get emails and people reach out to me all the time. Like, we're looking for teachers of color. We're looking to diversify our organization. Where, do you know anybody? So it's like, no, we don't know everybody who identifies as Black, Latinx, or Asian, or Indigenous in the States. So the answer is, we might know somebody, but we don't know everybody. But I think what I think that tells us, that piece of information tells us, is that a lot of our organizations, a lot of our institutions are rooted in old practices, in institutional racism, and it really demonstrates the need to redevelop and redesign the way we're hiring and the way we're recruiting and bringing people in, because I have 10, 20, 30 people I could hit up and say they might be good for this job, or they're interested in teaching, right? We have no problem. I think that's one of the reasons that we've been successful in some of our programming and reaching out and creating a community, because we actually know people, right? They're in the community, or we are friends with them, or we make it's part of our values to build relationships with all types of people. And so I think, like, one, your hiring practices need to change. And so the fact that you can say, there are no qualified teachers of candidates, we know that that's not true. It's just not. It's like, it's like I push people to think I push people to think, what are you doing that might be bringing you to this place of, like, you cannot find folks, and then two, it's like changing the way you're doing things. So I think that that's one misconception. There's many more, but I'll let Travis add on to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Carla, this point about hiring is something that I found in my own research. So I did a study in a New England school district, a large urban New England school district, many years ago, and I looked at the experiences of Black men who were the only Black male teacher in their school, and I compared that to experiences of Black men who were in schools with many more Black male teachers. And one of the interesting things I asked Black men who were the only Black male teachers was about hiring. And so these men in these schools, talked about how that they joined the hiring committee to get more folks of color, people of color, men in the profession. They talked about how they would share job postings with colleagues that they deemed to be good teachers in previous schools to come and apply. That when these people actually did come and apply and teach at these schools, that members of the hiring committee, most of whom were white women, said that these candidates were not a good fit, right? And so it wasn't the case that people weren't applying, and it wasn't the case that at least one member of the hiring committee believed that these people were good teachers because they had taught with them in a previous setting. But the issue appeared to be that there was bias in terms of the hiring process. And there's clear evidence that there is actually bias in terms of teacher hiring. One study looked at a Virginia school district and found that Black teachers were tracked into schools on average, serving larger percentages of Black children. And so I think that one misconception that I think that is out there in the field is that, as Carla said, is that we can't find enough, rather than thinking about, one, how are you treating the people in your building to want to go out and share the gospel, share the good news about how great it is to work at this school, right? You can't be good to these imagined Black people, these imagined Latinx people, if you aren't being good to the people who are in your school, right? Your best recruiters are the people that you're most proximate with. Mm-hmm. One, and if you have these processes in the hiring committee that screen out educators of color, you have to think about and examine bias in your hiring process.
Mm-hmm. That was amazing from both of you. And Carla, I just wanted to circle back because you touched on a point that is not often named when we think about educators of color in the United States public schools, and it is that white supremacy is alive and it's well, and it does exist in those settings. And educators of color often have to circumvent and think of ways to sustain themselves in order to, remain where they are in those schools, in those districts. I just want to really emphasize that point that you named earlier. And speaking of hiring, you both spoke elaborately about that topic. K through 12 school districts, throughout the nation have sought, like you've all said, to increase educator diversity. And some of these methods that create pathways to recruit and sustain are what you're describing here, right? So the grow your own programs, the teacher residency models. And Carla, I know that at the Equity Institute, you all have begun an EduLead fellowship as a way to recruit people into the teaching profession. And you also have the EduLeaders of Color as a way to retain educators of color. I'm just curious if you could say more about both of those responding to the need that is appearing in Rhode Island.
Yeah, sure. So EduLeaders of Color is our community-driven initiative that's really, we started in 2016. It was very grassroots approach to the work, and we hold monthly meetups where we invite people throughout the state to come in, to network, to build, to innovate, to share ideas. And it's open to all, but we specifically focus on BIPOC educators and educational leaders throughout the state. So that's something that we've continued since, so now for almost 5 years. We grew from that and then became the Equity Institute. So we did things a little bit different, which is, it's like my thing. I'm not a conventional person. I do things, a little bit different. So you'll see that throughout our conversation today. But the EduLead Fellowship was initiated and started during COVID, 2020, last year. And I am not going to take credit, and I don't take credit for like everything that I'm talking about here. My team is amazing. The people that I have working together, the people that are devoted to seeing the change are the people that make this work happen. And those people are not here today. Well, they might be in listening, but they're not here speaking. So I just want to shout them out, my whole Equity Institute team, because they really make this work happen. And the EduLead Fellowship is really Carlin Howard's, my co-founder, and also my partner's work. And he's been amazing in starting it up. And what we did was basically, again, use that lived experiences to create something that I think is working and is growing. And really, this program unleashes the potential of BIPOC community members to become teachers. And so who are these people that we're talking about? And that's part of our first cohort. They are para-educators, teachers' aid, student services coordinators, administrative assistants, who have been working in the neighborhoods. We're working mostly with Providence, Central Falls, Pawtucket here in Rhode Island. So they've been in the neighborhood schools for years. They have so much experience. They're multilingual. So 80% of our cohort, they speak another language, whether it be Creole, Portuguese, or Spanish. So multilingual, racially and ethnically diverse. Again, we didn't have to go very far to tap into that potential. They were living right in the community. So because they're from the community, they already have deep relationships with students, with their families. Many of them they want to become teachers, but have faced significant barriers, some what I've mentioned, and then additionally, some other ones that I might not have gone through, but that are real and have been a barrier for them attaining their bachelor's degree in teaching, right? So what this program aims to do is to remove those barriers, to offer a pathway to a college degree and a teaching credential in less than 3 years. So what we did is Equity Institute partnered with a Rhode Island-based education nonprofit called College Unbound, actually run by Dennis Lickey, my mentor that I mentioned earlier. It is an accredited post-secondary institution for returning adult learners. Our goals are simple with this program. We want to recruit, develop, support, and retain diverse teacher workforce. We want to give more students of color the experience of being taught by teachers with similar backgrounds. We want to improve career choices and income for BIPOC professionals working in the educational space. And we want to develop a new generation of educational leaders. We're able to do this in 4 ways. So this is the way it works. We identify folks, which, like I said, it's not hard. They're close in proximity to us. So again, I think like that community piece is so important in any state that you're working in. We meet adult learners where they are. So we are very cognizant of the fact that folks are juggling multiple responsibilities. They might have children, they may not have the resources, whatever it might be, they are juggling a lot. But they've gained significant and relevant work experience. So what our program does is that we take those experiences, and we do this because we partner with College Unbound. We take those experiences and transfer them to actual credits. Something similar like big picture learning schools, like what they do in terms of assessing students. So we don't, if a teacher has been in the classroom for 25 years as a teaching assistant, we're like, okay, let's look at your teacher, your experience in that field, and let's now build credit so that we could put it towards your bachelor degrees. We don't want to have folks start all over again when they've had such critical experience and meaningful experiences in the classroom. And so on average, folks in the program can graduate between 2 to 5, 2.5 to 3 years. The people in that cohort, in the program are able to keep their jobs. So we don't make them leave their jobs. They have to work and make money, and they take classes in the evenings and on the weekends. This third part is really important. We provide them with a network of support. So what I mean by that is that my co-founder is on call all the time, 8 o'clock at night, 9 o'clock in the morning. Yes, Travis. I'd be like, who's calling you? And he's like, it's, so-and-so from the cohort, they're going through something. So that level of support when fellows are frustrated with the system, when they're frustrated with their day, they're able to call our co-founder who's leading the program and other folks on the team and talk to them and get advice and walk them through some real solutions. And so I think that is such a critical part of making this program work. And then the third one is that, we anchor the experience in equity and justice. So we're really focused on preparing them to lead in the classroom from this racial justice classroom. I feel like this program has been a result of us reimagining what pathway development and design can look like for bringing more diverse teachers into the workforce, and not going very far to find them. And so this all sounds great, but we're working with the state of Rhode Island State of Education department. We're working with many partners to try to make this really successful, to make it grow, to create a model that could be used in other states beyond Rhode Island.
So speaking of other states, Travis, I know you were previously on the East Coast. You're now on the West Coast. Carla and I have plans to bring you back to the East Coast. But I'm just curious. I'm just curious, Travis, in your travels throughout the nation, who is doing this well? And by this, I mean, like, who is retaining, who is recruiting, who is like offering support for educators of color once they're in the classroom, and why is it working for them?
Mm-hmm. Happy to come before the snow. New England snow, no thank you. So it's a loaded question, but here are some. So first, at the federal level, right before Secretary King left office, he invited a bunch of folks to the department. He had a national summit on teacher diversity. That the power of the Secretary of Education to convene, less really act, but to convene folks and get folks together, I think really became a catalytic moment in the teacher diversity workspace. And so out of that discussion that happened in 2015 at the department, or maybe spring 2016 at the department, I think led to what I think was some really ambitious work that I think has really made some movement on the state level. So one place was Saroja Warner, when she was working at the Council for Chief State School Officers. They convened 10 states across the country. Massachusetts was one of them. You had Massachusetts, you had Mississippi, you had New York, Colorado, a bunch of diverse states got together, Nebraska got together and said that we're going to set some targets for increasing the number of educators of color. I think in terms of a state, I'd say that Massachusetts really led with that work, because what Massachusetts did was, before they went out to begin to tell districts to support districts, they recognized that they had to fix some stuff in-house. That they had to do some internal work to understand bias, to get some language around equity. And I think that has led to this bill that my friend and colleague Amanda Fernandez is working on with Latinos for Education. So Massachusetts has a bill that's making its way through the legislature, which I think is comprehensive in nature, that looks at both recruitment, support, induction, and retention. We in the state of California, we also have a bill, AB 520, being sponsored by an Assembly Member Gibson and our state superintendent, Tony Thurman, that's aimed at recruiting and supporting, mainly supporting male educators of color. And that's looking at induction support, that's looking at supporting districts to develop plans. So I think that California is doing some really ambitious work. I should also say nationally, President Biden, that feels good to say, President Biden, you might remember in his address to Congress, talked about the American Families Plan, and is giving money, or has committed, is proposing that money be given to teacher residency programs. Carla talked about her work in teacher residency with the Power of Teacher Residency. Alexis, you were in a teacher residency program. I worked. I'm on the board of the National Center for Teacher Residencies, and there's clear evidence that teachers who spend a year in their site, understanding the context in which children are working and children are living and then working in that environment, can increase learning. And so the National Center for Teacher Residency, and I think there's some real promise happening at the federal level through the American Families Plan. Secretary Cardona has mentioned, there was a recent event that he held at the department where he talked about his commitment to educator diversity. And finally, in terms of local school districts, I also think that NYC Men Teach in New York City, 2016, Mayor de Blasio committed public dollars, $16 million, to an effort aimed at recruiting, supporting male educators of color, and the city has reached that target. They put up public money. Not only were they thinking about recruitment, but they also matched each of these new recruits with a mentor, and those mentors received high quality training around how you support a novice male teacher. So I think some of the work in New York City, you can go to nycmenteach.org to learn more about it. So those are, I think, some of the promising places that folks should, when you think about who's doing it well, those are some of the places I would turn to.
Thanks, Travis. And I also wanted to, you mentioned Massachusetts and the Educator Diversity Act that Latinos for Education is working on. And I just wanted to really focus on like policy and really think about policy as a way to, implement practices for both recruitment and retention and really sustaining educators of color in this profession. But I want to pivot now to asking and seeing if you guys could answer a few audience questions. I have had the pleasure, and we've all heard some rich information from both Carla and Travis. And I want to be fair to all of you who are attending. And so I'm going to ask a couple of questions that have been posed here by the audience. So the first question is that I see work being done to recruit more educators of color by some local, states, organizations, or foundations, but there doesn't seem to be a systemic and sustainable approach to this issue. In the past, the government had a role in addressing an educator shortage of any kind via college funding support, loan forgiveness. And given that the government has a legacy of enacting policies that have led to this, led us to this place, what role do you believe the government could play?
I could share some ideas. Although I feel like my friend here, Travis, will probably have way more information than I do. But I think one, there needs to be definitely, yes, investment by our government into some of this work. And I think, Travis, you mentioned some of like the just commitment from our government officials, investing in state and district strategies to recruit and retain. So we've done some work in the past where there's been investment by not just government, but also foundations to recruit. And we've seen some significant change, but the retention piece is not there. I think more investment we need to see by the government in investment in state and districts to support and develop, grow your own program. So we want to see more of that. There are some places that are already, doing that. Like I think Illinois is one of them, and some other places across the country. I don't have that information on me right now, but also I know there's a lot of talks right now about ESSER funds and money coming from the American Rescue Plan Act. And so I think there's real opportunity right now for states to be thinking about, for the government to be investing into state and districts, and states to be thinking about how they want to use these funds specifically for efforts that are tied directly to recruiting and retention teachers of color. And I think one of the retention strategies is what Travis was mentioning in the work around understanding those biases that we have in processes and practices that institutions engage in to recruit and retain.
So I would just add, there are a couple of things I would just add on to what Carla said. I think this current administration is committed, unlike the previous administration, to ensuring that teachers receive their loan forgiveness. I think that we need to raise the cap for loan forgiveness. Teachers of color have higher debt burdens because of historic racism, and so so I think that and the Center for American Progress wrote this really great piece a couple of years ago around how student loans, right, act as a barrier for aspiring or prospective teachers of color. So I think we could address loan forgiveness. I think a lot of this could be captured in the reauthorization of the Higher Education Act. So we recently, President Obama reauthorized the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, currently called the Every Student Succeeds Act, ESSA, and it's currently the Higher Education Act has not been reauthorized, and there are lots of pieces, lots of titles in HEA. I wrote a piece for this on Brookings that I think I shared with you all that maybe you can share out. There are lots of places where the federal government could increase funding. So residency programs could be one of them. It's important to note also that the majority of teachers of color, particularly Black and Latinx teachers, graduate not from UC Berkeley, not from Stanford, but from Hispanic serving institutions and historically Black colleges and universities. And those institutions are not receiving anywhere close to the required funding that they need to train more Black or Latinx teachers. And so a reauthorized Higher Education Act could and should include more resources, not only to support teacher candidates, but also to train teacher educators. I think that is also another piece in this puzzle. If you think teachers, we have very few teachers of color, we have very few people preparing teachers. Alexis, I'm sure you know this well, right? And Carl, you know this well. And so we also need support and funding to train teacher educators and to increase the number of folks of color who are teacher educators who can work with aspiring teachers. So I think that we can capture some of this comprehensive approach from the government by including resources in a reauthorized Higher Education Act.
Thanks. Another question that's come up a few times is around, you know, the importance of focusing on kids who are young. So this person writes, you know, should a major focus be on kids who are young so they can gain an appreciation for being a teacher? What will it take to get young kids to consider teaching as a profession?
I'll keep mine short, Travis, and then I'll let you. But one, that representation piece is important. You need to see yourself. You need to see yourself reflected. It goes a long way. I do think that it does start early on, and the representation is what I will highlight here. Other than that, I think it's about understanding what it entails. If the relationships are not good in the classroom with teachers, kids are not going to have a good experience, and they're not going to say, I want to be a teacher when I grow up, if they don't have healthy, positive relationships with their teachers. So I think the representation piece, building good relationships with your students, will go a long way in leaving an impact on your student. And the reason I say that is because I never thought about being a teacher, and I don't really remember having great relationships with my teachers, but I also didn't know what I wanted at 16 or 17 or 18 or even 19, right? So I wasn't sure. So, I think like having those good relationships and the representation piece can help.
Every single day in this country, we practice educational malpractice to most of the nation's children of color. How foolish would anyone be to want to return to a place that has consistently demonstrated malpractice? So I think the first thing we have to do is we have to create schools that are joyful, that are loving, that center the experiences of Black, Latinx, Indigenous, Asian American children so that they could want to then return to those places. We can't create pathways into teaching if we disproportionately suspend and expel Black and Latinx children, like we do here on the left coast in California. I've often started to talk very publicly about my son's experience. I didn't know that preschool suspension was a thing until I went to go pick up my son who was attending a Montessori preschool in Manhattan, until the director pulled me into the office and said that my son needed to take a 2-week break. Then I began talking to a bunch of other academics. Then I saw the report from the Civil Rights Division under John King that said that Black children were being suspended from preschool at a disproportionately higher rate than their peers. And so so we can't push people out, and we can't suspend people. And I know this personally, right? If we can't do these things, can't have these practices before people can think about a profession while they're currently in K-12 schools.
We have time for one more. Yes. Okay, let's try it. So one challenge I see, how do we go about diversifying the educator workforce when so many existing teachers, primarily white teachers, have tenure?
Well, I'm gonna keep it real right now. I don't want to answer that question because I think it's a complex question, and I'm not trying to go there with that. I actually wanted to go to the question below it. But Travis, if you want to answer that question, go ahead. I'm not gonna do that.
I mean, there's a teacher shortage, so we need more teachers. At least, I don't know in Massachusetts, but in California, we have a teacher shortage. Many places across, in many disciplines, we have a teacher shortage. So that seems, I think we need more teachers, period. And the evidence is clear that teachers of color, Black, Latinx teachers increase outcomes. So that to me, yeah, I don't fully agree with the underlying ideas embedded in that question.
and I agree, Travis, the question that I wanted to address, the last question, I think, it was are colleges and universities part of the problem, and what makes trained teachers do poorly in urban setting but thrive in suburban rural areas besides color. So it seems like there's different levels to that, but I would say colleges and universities are part of, looking at it from an asset base, are part of the solutions. So when we're thinking about the teaching programs and having quality teaching programs, so what I've seen in the education programs in higher ed institutions here, and I've taught as an adjunct professor in one, is there's no work around equity. There's no work around the pedagogies that are grounded in culturally responsive teaching and equity pedagogy. And so there's a big missed opportunity at that level to adequately train teachers to be prepared to have those quality skill sets that Travis talked about earlier, the things that he was able to do, I was able to do in the classroom: build relationships, manage my classroom, talk about different topics, use formative assessment and in order to modify instruction, create small groups, to have conversations. And so there's this big piece, I think, missing at the higher ed in programs, and that's who's teaching and what do they look like and how long have they been there and what kind of lens do they bring to the work. So just like we have to do work in other spaces in schools, the work needs to be done at the same time with higher ed institutions, so everybody is in alignment, and then we can actually see some changes. And I forget the other two questions, but maybe Travis, you can address that.
I'll pitch to you, Alexis, where you think, was it what organization? I'm trying to respond to some of the questions here, and yeah. So Alexis, I'll go wherever you tell me to go. Answer whatever question you think I should answer.
Yeah, it was about, the question was about educators of color doing better in like suburban school districts. So what was the issue with urban school districts there? But I know we're at time, so if you can't answer it now, Travis, that's fine.
I mean, so I think we do know that on average, at least Black teachers, this is what I know, Black teachers are concentrated in schools serving Black children. And so they're making choices, one, to teach in places that are demographically familiar to them. And it's also true that Black teachers are also tracked into certain types of school settings that do not have the working conditions needed that will allow them to thrive. And so that begins to explain why, on average, Black teachers have higher turnover rates than their peers. So I think that maybe begins to get at in terms of urban versus suburban placement and why that is.
I'd like to just first deeply thank Carla and Travis for your lively, informative, and passionate discussion today. I'd also like to thank everyone who attended this conversation. And I just want to close this conversation by really emphasizing that we are now in the midst of educator hiring season. Schools and districts across the country are in the process of hiring their educators for fall. So I really urge you all to attend your school board meetings, even if they're just virtually for now, and ask these questions of your elected and appointed school board members and your district leaders. I also encourage you all to have, conversations around educators of color and what your experiences have been with them in this country or the lack thereof, with your family members, your friends, and colleagues. I just want to thank you all for attending and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. There are